Welcome to Divisionalysis. I'm Fog and the time has come. Today we combine build with skills, with weapon, with talent, put them all together and find out what is the most damaging assault rifle build in the Division 2. Let's go. Well, it's been a long time coming, but we have weapon handling data, including optimal range stats. We've got the correctly calculated reload speeds for each of the assault rifles. We've got in-game statistics, and we've got the damage output for each of the weapon systems. We've now included headshots, and we've got the stats for damage output from each one of the weapon talents. And it's time to combine them with these two builds and find out which one will be crowned king. So where we left in the last episode was we had an accuracy over distance, which was combined with optimal range data to give us a damage over distance chart. We then were able to combine that with headshot accuracy and the damage that headshots produce, and we came up with another chart which was a complete continuum across 0 to 50 meters. I then removed NPCs without heads to reduce the headshot damage, and then we applied the in-game statistics for how often you will encounter NPCs at these particular distances, and we came up with an accuracy weighted profile for every one of the weapons. But this profile was based on each weapon producing 100% of its own damage, not its damage in comparison to other weapons. So now we can finally do that, combining the weapon's integral damage output with its accuracy weighted profile, and for multi-target DPS, this is what it looks like. And what you can see is that there are two clear standouts as far as damage output is concerned for multi-target damage. The yellow line is one that we already knew, inclusive of the talent Perfect on Empty, or the Burnout, and the St. Elmo's with its superior mods and superior sustained damage. So according to this, the St. Elmo's competes with the FAMAS with 40% weapon handling as far as damage output is concerned, other than between 16 and 27 meters, at which point the FAMAS's optimal range starts to take a toll and the St. Elmo's retakes the lead. For single target DPS, similar sort of story with St. Elmo's out on top. This time the FAMAS is much closer in regards to its damage output. But now without the Burnout's talent, just turns into a FAMAS. And it is only the rail splitter that is able to gain the lead from the St. Elmo's for the briefest of times at around about the 25 meter mark. This is every weapon with its own damage output across the full spectrum, except only a few of them currently have talents added. But what you can see is that already there is a large difference between a multi-target damage and a single target damage. If we averaged all of the assault rifles across the entire spectrum, we're looking at between 10 and 22% more damage by being able to fire the complete magazine. And if I take both of the weapon profiles and show you side by side, you can see that difference reflected here. The thing is, when we are using a 6 red build, to the best of my research capabilities, we are averaging about 1/3 multi-target damage, or 1/3 we are expending the full magazine, and 2/3 of the time we are stopping short, either because we have a lack of targets, pressure from the enemy, or it is a burst fire situation. And in a 1/3, 2/3 graph, this is what it looks like, and as you can see, the purple line, the St. Elmo's, sits out above all others, including the Burnout and the Rail Splitter, even though they have talents included. The black line is the next closest rival, and that is the FAMAS. And if I change the proportions to be half multi-target and half single target damage, you can see the changes, and the St. Elmo's widens its gap on the FAMAS. And the same again if we go to a 2/3, 1/3 orientation. So it's actually the 1/3, 2/3 proportionality that presents the best possible chance for the FAMAS to have a fighting chance. What you can see here is that purple line of the St. Elmo's sits well above all of the other assault rifles, and it's going to take a very good talent to bring any of those weapons up to the rank of the St. Elmo's. I've decided to settle on just the named weapons, exotics, and a handful of the top performing weapons with a handful of the top performing talents. So you've already seen the Burnout and the Rail Splitter and Born Great, and also the Glory Days. Those are already part of that diagram that you saw before. We also won't see any improvement for the SIG and the Mechanical Animal. It's a talent that I'm going to explore a little later down the track, but at this point in time it is just a plain old SIG. The ones that we really want to look out for are the Shield Splinterer with Perfect Optimist, the Kingbreaker, which I am going to give the full 20% amplified damage from Perfect Flatline. We have the Invisible Hand with Perfect Allegro, the Savage Wolverine with Perfect Close and Personal. We have the Test Subject with Perfectly in Sync as well. I'm going to combine that data with the exotics. The Capacitor and the St. Elmo's we are leaving with just their base damage. Once again, I'll look into the Capacitor when we start to explore skills in a little more detail. And skill builds, for that matter, where it really starts to shine. For the Eagle Bearer, no tenacity buff, but the Eagle Strike, so an accuracy increase of up to 30% is going to be added to the build. If you saw my Chameleon video, you understand that Adaptive Instincts has an incredible potential to add damage, well exceeding the damage available on the St. Elmo's. It comes down to uptime. So I researched my own gameplay and the gameplay of others, and I came up with an average for the amount of time that each one of the buffs was up. No buff, 20% of the time. Single buff, 15%. Two buffs, 32% of the time. And all three buffs were active 33% of the time whilst engaging targets. So when damage mattered, this is the percentages that the buff was up. We've also got the Bighorn, and I briefly touched on this weapons talent as part of another video, and once you start to increase your headshot percentage, this buff can provide you a massive amount of added damage. The problem is that it only is really viable within 15 meters, and that is if you are an absolute god with this weapon, which is very hard because it handles pretty poorly. When I looked at my stats, I put together a build, I tried to do it. The best that I could average was 66% stacks, and that's what I'm going to go with. So my best average as far as maintaining stacks goes, that's what I'm going to give the Bighorn. The three standard weapons that I'm going to go with are the FAMAS, CTAR, and the M4. Couldn't be complete if I didn't put the FAMAS in with fast hands, and we calculated this during the series at an average added damage output of 12.5%. The CTAR, excellent reload speed, great rate of fire, and an excellent optimal range drop-off, making it actually a very, very good performer and a top tier weapon, provided that its low total magazine damage doesn't impact your ability to be able to take down an enemy. But with our maximum damage output build, this isn't going to be a problem, and I'm pairing this with Ranger. Ranger was an easy one to do because it's a spectrum of damage over distance, and our chart is divided by distance. So it's simply 2% for every 5 meters, and then we'll base it on the number of encounters that we have at those distances. The M4 is included because it's the best weapon available where flatline can be added, and we're going to give it, just like the Kingbreaker, its full buff of 15%. That is the complete suite of weapons and talents that we are adding into the next chart, and this is what it looks like. It's quite a muddled mess. There is no longer a clear, defined winner as far as damage output is concerned. When we apply the averages for how often we will encounter targets at these distances, the heroic engagements, this is what the weapon outputs look like. For the first initial period, we have the chameleon rising above the pack. In the next portion, where the chameleon no longer can consistently provide a positive return on headshots, it is the FAMAS with fast hands that takes over the lead. Once the weapons settle down to 100% body shots being the most effective tactic available, it is the chameleon that again rises to the top. But its poor accuracy and its poor optimal range means that it is a swift drop downwards, and at 26 meters it is actually the Kingbreaker that steals a brief moment in the light before its optimal range and accuracy start to take a toll, and from that point onwards it is the Talent Ranger that puts the CTAR above all others. So which one is the best? Well, when you total all of the damage output across all of the distances, taking into consideration the amount of time that is going to be engaging targets at that distance, you get a simple bar graph that looks like this. And the chameleon is the standout performer for damage output at heroic engagements. It is a very close fought second place for the FAMAS with fast hands and the St. Elmos. It is then a drop down to the Kingbreaker, even though we're using an unrealistic damage bonus and being its full buff of 20%. We then have the test subject with a 95% uptime, dependent on skills. Doesn't matter, it's fallen down the list. And then further down we have the burnout and the CTAR falling behind. So our top three performers, the chameleon, FAMAS with fast hands, and the St. Elmos. The chameleon being the standout performer at heroic engagement distances. Would be a fairly easy attribution to put the chameleon onto our damage meta builds, but the truth of the matter is that these two builds are realistically only going to be the highest damage output builds at the legendary level, potentially incursion level. Now, I haven't done a complete analysis of engagement distances for legendary play, but what I can tell you unequivocally is that the engagement distance for legendary is at least 5 meters further than what it is for heroic. And when we place an additional 5 meters onto our engagement distances, we get a brand new chart that looks like this. What we actually have is, for the first part, it's a close run race, but for the majority of the first 10, maybe out to 15 meters, it's actually the Bighorn which is producing the most damage. Again, it is the FAMAS with fast hands that starts to take over when the Bighorn can no longer viably take headshots. And then when all weapons settle down to 100% body shots, again the chameleon rises above the pack. And it's a similar story at the back end, with a brief moment in the light for the Kingbreaker before Ranger starts to take over as being the dominant damage output talent. But the thing is, when you total all of the damage outputs across all of the engagement ranges with their relevant percentages, this is the bar graph. And what we see is that the St. Elmos rises to the top. Practically number 2 for every engagement distance gives it the total damage output crown. The chameleon, as the distance to target starts to lengthen, or as engagement distances start to push out, the chameleon starts to take a drop. The FAMAS with fast hands also starts to take a drop because of its short engagement or optimal range of only 27 meters. The chameleon just happens to be falling faster. I even included in this one FAMAS with Ranger, because it seemed to be the talent that was producing the best results when distances were starting to be lengthened. And the FAMAS with Ranger actually brought in the 4th spot. We saw a drop to the Kingbreaker again, engagement distance and also accuracy playing a part. Test subjects stayed relatively solid. CTAR with Ranger obviously starting to rise up the ranks, and the Burnout with its ability to target better at range with its weapon handling also started to rise up the ranks a little bit. What you can see here is that at Heroic it is the Chameleon being the standout, with the St. Elmo's roughly number 2, and at even just an extended range of just 5 meters, the St. Elmo's is beginning to climb, and this continues to happen as you extend the distance. As you extend that distance, accuracy and stability start to count for more damage. The poor accuracy, poor optimal range of the Chameleon, any increase on the distance and it is rapidly dropping down the ranks and is virtually out of any chance of contention as soon as you reach a plus 10 meter range. That additional weapon handling, the stability and the accuracy will also add damage when targeting specific areas on enemies, something that's not included in this chart. So with the Chameleon now out of contention, it's down to the St. Elmo's and the FAMAS with fast hands. But we also have 2 skills that are adding damage to our builds. And in a face-off between the FAMAS with fast hands versus the St. Elmo's, it's the St. Elmo's that benefits the most from both of these skills. Any increase in the duration of damage provided by the shield, and you are moving into the realms of sustained damage more often, which the St. Elmo's is the king. And with the booster hive, the St. Elmo's receives a 17.6% buff from the booster to its reload times, whereas the FAMAS only receives 14.5% on average, because it is already using fast hands and a reload speed bonus just to keep it in the race, and it receives diminished returns from that booster hive buff. And when you factor in that booster hive reload bonus on top of the gunner weapon handling bonus, on top of the striker's weapon handling bonus, and the lower base reload speed for the St. Elmo's in the first place, it's actually a 50-50 split as to which weapon is going to stack striker stacks faster, regardless of the extra RPM that the FAMAS possesses. And that's not factoring in that you're likely to hit more rounds on target with the St. Elmo's, thereby building stacks faster that way. Now, regardless of all of these tiny factors that are acting more in favor of the St. Elmo's, the largest consideration that has not been included in any part of these graphs up to this point, it is the damage added by the St. Elmo's talent. And in my opinion, Actum Est is a top tier damage talent. When you factor in every 3rd magazine is going to be 70 rounds of shock ammo. That's 1/3 of the time that you have this talent available to you. When you use it and use it effectively, you can practically shut down 100% of incoming damage, meaning that you are going to be outputting multiple target DPS or enduring damage, sustained damage, for practically 1/3 more of the time than what you would without this talent. And remembering that the difference between burst firing or single target damage and multi-target damage was up to 22% damage output. As a point of reference, this clip that you're watching right now, I went back and tallied up the amount of sustained damage versus burst firing damage that I was doing. 45% of the time I was able to expend the entirety of my magazine. Generally, the only times where I wasn't expending the full portion of my magazine was when I'd run out of targets. But somewhere between 0 and 22%, 1/3 of the time. So somewhere between 0 and 7%, this talent is going to be adding to your damage output. On top of that, every single time you shock a target, it becomes practically stationary. Whatever shots you were missing because a target was moving is now eliminated. You will miss probably 30% of your shots if a target is moving as opposed to if it's standing still. So on 1/3 of the time, you are gaining up to 30% more damage during that period. This talent, if you watched my talent series, definitely ranks among the top for damage output, and none of that was considered when we put these graphs together, and it's still, this weapon still managed to total the highest damage output.
Even if I was to say that we're only accessing that sustained damage benefit 50% of the time we're using those shock rounds, and even if I was to say that we're only landing an additional 7 rounds out of an entire 70 round magazine on targets that we would have missed if they weren't shocked into place, that is still an additional 20% additional damage every third magazine, adding 7% damage output to the St. Elmos. And even if I was to cut that back even more, do it more discredit and only attribute 5% additional damage to the St. Elmo's talent, this is what the graphs look like. Making the St. Elmo's the clear damage output winner. And unfortunately for the pristine example build, it cannot access the St. Elmo's. When you combine that with the fact that any change in the ratio of sustained to burst fire is going to widen the gap that the St. Elmo's has on the FAMAS. Any increase on the range past 5 meters, which was a low estimate as far as the engagement distances for Legendary are concerned, again, the St. Elmo's furthers its lead on the FAMAS. And pristine example may well be the highest single damage talent in the game, but any time that perfect focus buff drops out, whether it is because of a grenade, a shield break, or whether it's just because you want to move, you are going to lose roughly 40% of your damage, and it's going to take you another 10 seconds of uninterrupted play to build that back up again and get to a point where you're still outputting less damage than the striker's build. And I have zero hesitation, zero question in my mind that this is the highest assault rifle damage output build in the Division 2. Now, although this build is backed by hundreds of hours of research, am I going to call it the new meta? I don't care what you call it, but I'm not going to call it the meta because my research isn't complete yet. As with any damage build, this build comes with a lot of caveats. Those caveats are that this is the build that is capable of delivering the most damage, but it's also delivering damage to a single target at a time. The two questions are you able to access that capability all the time? And 2, what about a build that can damage multiple enemies at the same time, even though it's outputting less damage to a single target? What happens if I change one of these red cores to a blue core? And this is a concept that I see even the most experienced players struggling to grasp. I'll take you back to this graph here. The reason why we use a shield isn't primarily about survivability, although that definitely helps. Using blue cores isn't necessarily about survivability. What it is it gives you the access to an extra 10 to 22% damage by being able to endure more damage and fire the full complement of your magazine. When you are firing for less, your weapon is doing 0 damage for longer. If you can do damage for longer, you will output more damage. If you can sustain damage for longer, you will output more damage. And the question is, if I sacrifice some of my build's capability, will I, on average, output a greater amount or total damage? An additional 22% damage is double the average add that any of the weapon talents can provide, and triple that of the added damage to the last weapon core that you add to your build. Access to that portion of damage can very quickly outweigh a small sacrifice on the build. And it's not survivability. It is about accessing a greater portion of your build's damage capability. For the longest time, meta has been whatever is capable of putting out the most damage. But that is only capable of putting out that damage if it's able to access all of that damage.
And in coming videos, we'll explore that very thing. If you like this one, hit the like button. If you want to see or know how to access a greater amount of your damage capability, hit the subscribe button. But I will see you in the next one. Fog out.